So welcome to this evening's Dharma time. We're going to be discussing mostly Yoga Sutras and starting with the first dozen or so sutras. And we'll start with a little quiet period. As I ring the bell and it goes to silence, we'll aim for that same quality of silence ourselves. So while we sit quietly, rather than be preoccupied with or evaluating thoughts, I'm going to invite your mind to rest. And you could imagine any little thought cluster that arises like a ripple on the water. It smooths itself out as you give it less attention. Let your primary attention rest with the possibility of your mind being more reflective, not more agitatable. Naturally, any time that we come to sit still, or we come to a pause, you may find that you're sifting through the echo of activities from today or yesterday or many countless yesterdays. You might find that mental habit now feels like it has your full attention and decides to go up in volume. And yet sitting still is also a chance for us to come back to a kind of quiet leadership over the mind habits and to remember that which is deeper than mind habit. If over the next few quiet minutes you still notice that the echoes are very strong, that the ripples on the water increase or become agitated, then give your mind something gentle to hold on to. You might use a simple mantra like breathing in, breathing out, or a place of neutral sensation to rest your thinking mind, like the feeling of where you're making contact with the ground just now. And with appreciation for the efforts that you've made over the last few minutes, however those efforts turned out, appreciate that you made an effort for quiet leadership with your mind. And you can join your palms into Anjali Mudra. And with your exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. And release your hands and open your eyes. This past week, prior to having the need to be in bed for illness sake, I was interviewing some colleagues because I'm having my first experience of making a telesummit. I can't really even tell you what that is, a telesummit. I don't know the difference between a telesummit and a webinar and a whatever other names they have for those things. But I was interviewing some colleagues. You'll know who they are soon enough, so I'll tell you who I spoke to this week. I was talking with Hala Corey, who is one of the founders of Off the Mat Into the World, Melanie Klein, who put together with a number of her colleagues the Yoga and Body Image Coalition. I was lucky to speak to my friend Raphael Kushner, who I've known for quite some time, and we were laughing together that we were having the closest Skype telesummit interview ever, because he's my neighbor. He's actually looking at renting the house like 3 doors down from where we live right now. And then I also got to speak to Kimber Simpkins, who wrote a book called Full, how she practiced yoga to tend to her insatiable appetite. This is a telesummit on hunger, hope, and healing, the book that I wrote. And something that I had in common with several of these interviewees was how preoccupied our minds were when we were in our disordered eating patterns or body image issues or addictions or romantic failures. Did anybody have any experience with romantic failure yet in life? Check. But the common ground and the place we had some amusement for ourselves, our younger selves, was how enormously preoccupying thoughts were. Specifically for me, thoughts about food in and food out, calories in, calories out, the kinds of foods, the time of day for food, the sorts of foods, the other people's food intake, and so on. This was enormously, tremendously, overwhelmingly preoccupying. However, it occupied my mind enough that I didn't have room for other things that would have been more scary, or that I had little to no knowledge about how to experience. In a way, it buffered me from a lot of the chaos that I otherwise would have experienced, because I had something from my mind to really think about very heavily, constantly and chronically. I expected that I would hear some of this from my friends, especially Kimber, Melanie, and Hala, not as much from Raphael. I expected to hear it because they've been through their own recovery journeys, so we were having a little bit of camaraderie about that. And I know that the mind preoccupies itself when it needs something tangible to grab onto, like when the gears of a clock want to have the other gears to hook into. Has anybody in the room experienced being preoccupied? How about incessantly and repeatedly preoccupied with the same content? Yeah. How about similar content with different dates and names? Yes. Yeah. Would you like to say something about why that is for people?
Not right now.
Okay, you let me know. This is my husband, Jay Gregory, who's a part of co-facilitating the yoga therapy training and gets to tag team on some of the Dharma talks with me. So what our ancestor yogis were asking in terms of the questions they had about the mind is why is it so? Why is it like that? Why is it so bothersome? And what can we do about it? And through their discoveries, they ended up charting what they discovered in different texts. And one of those texts is called the Yoga Sutras. Another one is called the Upanishads. We have the Bhagavad Gita, and we also have the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and several different kinds of sutras exist, by the way, not just Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But those aspirants of yoga who experienced the stepping stone method to awakening, they wrote the Yoga Sutras. And out of the delight of what they experienced in terms of freedom from that mind stuff, they said, yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Means yoga is occurring when that mind stuff stops being so incessant, repetitive, preoccupying. When I first read that in the Yoga Sutras, I couldn't apply it to myself, and I've said this before, I quickly closed the book and decided I wasn't going to read that part of yoga. Fortunately, I was able to open the book years later and actually have some guidance in reading the Yoga Sutras, because they are meant to be stepping stones on the human journey, and I would have missed a really incredible text. I also wasn't quite ready to be done with my mind preoccupations when I first opened the book on the Yoga Sutras. I really was looking for a self-help book in the genre that you would have seen in the bookstore where I worked in graduate school, which self-help books at the time, that was like a genre, I think it still exists in American publishing. But the Yoga Sutras are like the classic self-help book if you really want to help yourself very deeply understand the nature of being human. I didn't see it that way because it looked too intellectual for me at the time. It also looked impossible. To have the fluctuations of the mind cease, that just seemed like an impossibility, a far out there impossibility. So in the Yoga Sutras, what happens next is they start describing what you can do or what you might be experiencing if the cessations of the mind haven't ceased. If the fluctuations of the mind haven't ceased. I think it's important to know that our ancestor yogis, they studied a lot before they came to this understanding. They didn't just blink into it one day out of good luck and then decide to write it down. They went through a lot of personal study. They were rigorous about it, actually. Sometimes they removed themselves from the mainstream culture that they were living in or their householder duties, and sometimes they went up into mountains and into austere settings where they had very little comforts at all, and they wanted to study the nature of consciousness and the nature of their own mind. they were rigorous enough and dedicated enough for a long enough period of time with consistency enough that they had realizations that recurred. The realizations recurred enough for them that they were established as true. And one thing you'll hear in the Yoga Sutras at about 1.12 or 13, Patanjali tells us, in order to experience yoga, you have to practice consistently and for a long enough period of time, and with clear intention again and again to experience yoga. What I see happening in the West here, which I find tremendously good news, is that we have glimpses of that which isn't thought. When we practice yoga, we have glimpses of that which is not so preoccupying. We have glimpses of like grace or love or kindness. Or we have glimpses of our mind going silent for a moment, as if when you had the 45s and you picked the needle up off the record and the music suddenly stopped and it was silent, and you put the needle back down and it goes on again and you pick it up like this, and you had that silence. We have glimpses of that, and we have glimpses enough that we become intrigued. And that magnetically pulls us to the deeper study of yoga. And we're having those glimpses in urban settings, in rural settings. We're having them in community settings like we practice together, and we're having them in individual experiences too. So there's like a rapid increase in the numbers of people having this glimpse of what is possible when we're not so preoccupied. Now, sometimes when you get that glimpse, blessedly, the initial feeling of that glimpse is relief. Have you experienced that? Sometimes if you're in that glimpse long enough, after relief, there's terror. And the question might be, well, how could I live like that? How could I live in this glimpse of expansiveness or awe or mental quietude? How will I get things done? People often say, well, how will I pay the bills? How will I tend to the children? How will I do my job? So the first glimpse might be like relief, and then we get to experience the uneasiness. Because what it looks like is a pretty significant leap to go from where we have been to where that glimpse is recommending we go. I've said this recently, so some of you get to hear it again. I don't know of any teachings, spiritual or religious or otherwise, on the planet that recommend making your mind more complicated as a way to experience freedom. Do you know of any teachings like that? No. So even when we get that glimpse and there's this sense like, those are the teachings of yoga, I'm feeling it, I'm having that awe spell, we can feel terrified because we live in a culture that tells us that thinking and cognition and intelligence is really important and fundamental to a successful life. We are heavily conditioned in this regard. But after the terror, blessedly, there's another wave of relief. Like if you just sit for a little while in that terror, like, how will I live like this? The next thing that happened for me was a feeling that I didn't have to figure that out at that moment. I was willing to be someone who didn't know. Willing to experience the not knowing, as I refer to it. Also willing to experience the unknown, which are two different things. The great unknown and the willingness to experience not knowing, which for the human brain requires a certain amount of courage, the willingness to not know. In our developmental process, once the left brain comes on board and we start having language, we have this explosion of an ability to interact with other humans, starting to use words and cognition, and parents and teachers and siblings are excited because words are coming out of our mouths, and there's a whole communication revolution going on in there. And we get praised for knowing. We don't get as much appreciation for not knowing. And so that starts at about 2.5 to 3 years old, when your brain has the capacity for some language and cognition. But then the reinforcement we get for knowing goes on for, let's say, maybe about 24 years from there. Like with the amount of schooling that some of us go through. So from kindergarten through, let's say, bachelor's degree up till you're about 24 years old. That's a long time reinforcement in a period of life when your brain is still being developed and shaped by so much influence. Does it sound morose, what I'm saying? No. Like, it's realistic. You have had this experience as an American or as a Westerner. Mm-hmm. So when yoga comes into our world, some of what's happened here in the West is that we've used it to try to know things. Like trying to know where to put the pinky toe, or where to put the inner arch, or where to place the shoulder blade. And there is some great value that we can learn the architecture of the body and the architecture of the poses. But in the Yoga Sutras, as a text for the stepping stones to awakening, the word asana shows up once. It's mentioned as the third limb of yoga. It shows up in a little phrase. We say sukham stiram asanam, which means, asana in this phrase means when you take your seat, asana, it should be sukham stiram, steady and easeful. Sukham means easeful or happiness, like delight, and stiram means steady, consistent. So asana in this particular phrase in the sutras actually means to take a steady and comfortable seat. It doesn't mean downward dog pose. And asana in the other mention in the sutras means it's the third limb of yoga. It's the practice of physical gestures and physical positions to get the body ready for the next limb of yoga, which is pranayama, which is breathing practice. To get you ready for the next limb of yoga, which is called pratyahara, means to tend to your senses wisely, which gets you ready for the next limb of yoga, which is learning how to concentrate. We call it dharana in Sanskrit. That goes to dhyana and that goes to samadhi. But there on the third limb of yoga, you get to hear the word asana. So in this text, it's not really recommending that you learn how to place your shoulder blades. It's more talking about what are you going to do with your mind and with your attention, with awareness itself. Mm-hmm. So any questions before I go on from there? Any contributions that you want to make? Please do, because my robustness is half-mast right now. So you're welcome.
What I like about the Yoga Sutras is that they're very pragmatic. I like the first four of them. The first one is just, and now the study of yoga begins. Like, this is going to be, now we're going to talk about it. That's one of the sutras. Mm-hmm. And then by the time you get to the third is the Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha.
That's the second, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha.
And then by the time you get to the fourth, it says, I don't remember the exact Tantra's wording, but the way I think of it is, so if yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, then the next comes, and at other times,
yeah, yeah,
it's not so calm, basically. Mm-hmm. And then it proceeds to describe the various ways that we go astray from that and the ways that we can get to that. Mm-hmm. So it starts out as clear and clean and pure as you can get, and it just points the same direction, straight on out. Very pragmatic stuff. Mm-hmm. It has on the surface it has a sort of the woo-woo appearance. I think of a lot of Westerners think of the Eastern philosophies, but with a little bit of effort, it's pretty easy to see that it's incredibly efficient, mm-hmm. parsimonious. Mm-hmm. I find that very appealing. It's very elegant, really.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions or comments at the moment? No, so in the first Yoga Sutra, we are told now we'll start talking about yoga. In the second Yoga Sutra, we are told yoga is when the mind ceases to have all those fluctuations. The ripples on the water become very clear and reflective. And in the third sutra, we are told, and then, having experienced that, the seer abides in his or her own essence. You hear the word tada in the third Yoga Sutra. You hear the word svarupe. Svarupa means the bliss or the essence. So we are told, and then, drastu, we'll be abiding in our own essence. Now, the mind that got all that reinforcement for cognition and knowing and intellect could be quite baffled right there. And then the seer, who's the seer when you're a Westerner and you've been trained in mostly Western school systems? Who's the seer? And what does it mean to abide in your own essence? So I know we're not studying Zen Buddhism, but to me that particular phrase, then the seer abides in his or her own essence, was like a Zen koan. Wow, really? And then the seer abides. Then I went quickly to memory, and I thought of the movie, The Big Lebowski. Okay, you know this movie, The Big Lebowski, the dude abides. Like, okay, I like the word abides. I was into that. And I had seen this movie before I went back to reading the Yoga Sutras, so the word abides had some meaning for me. Then I was like, well, essence, what is essence? What is this essence we're abiding in? And who's the seer? Well, I had been through graduate school already, so I had studied some of the materials that could inform me when I knew that yoga, when they referred to the seer, they were talking about that larger presence in which we're seeing through this function called us. But we are the seer, the seen, and the seeing. We are the seer, the seen, and the seeing. We are those functions all at once. And so then the seer abides in his or her own essence. It means we remember our basic nature, our true nature. And that's what I think we glimpse when we experience Shavasana, or the tranquility of a moment of awe in the yoga classes that we take here in the West. And it's that glimpse that I think haunts us to come study more the philosophy of yoga. Like the high that you feel in the body from doing certain asana and the camaraderie and all that, that could happen in other exercise forms too. It happened for me on the field hockey field. It happened on the gymnastics apparatus. It happened in the orchestra. Like to play with the other instruments and to feel that camaraderie and the swell of all of that. I tasted it many times in other communal type activities. Sports and music were two of the most profound. Dance classes and even step aerobics, it happened there. Now we know that, I know this now as a result of the last decade of study for myself, that our brains are synchronized by rhythm, and in the rhythmic action of step aerobics with other brains, there was a certain high that occurred for that period, and that was really fun, and we had music and we had camaraderie. But I didn't experience after field hockey or after gymnastics or step aerobics, I did not experience abiding in my own essence. I did taste that in music. I tasted that in the orchestra. And partly because once you're playing in the orchestra, it's as if the music is coming through you. It's coming through every other musician, and there's a tangible kind of aliveness that would occur. And you must use both hemispheres of the brain to create the music. So there was a holistic event. And the silence at the end of a musical piece was like, for me, the Shavasana spell that we have in yoga. So I'd had some glimpses of that. But this thing called the essence, still in the third sutra, we don't quite know what that means yet if we're just picking up the book from the front side. We're going to talk about yoga, we're going to cease having fluctuations in the mind, then we're going to be abiding in this thing called our essence. I think it's a good haunt to have, to be wondering, and what is that essence? Because the next sutra says, at all other times, other things are occurring. Other things than this abiding in your essence are likely occurring. So when I was talking a bit ago about my friends Melanie and Hala and Kimber, we were discussing how intensely preoccupied we were with, like, every thought was about managing the body and food and the scale and the outcomes and the outfits and everything else. And we started having glimpses, each of us, we told our own story to each other, but started having these glimpses through the practice of yoga. And one of the glimpses that I had, and I was so delighted to share this moment with Kimber, I was saying, I started realizing that joy was not coming and going from me. I was coming and going from it. Like that was a life-shifting moment. Joy was not coming and going from me. I was coming and going from it. I was causing that to happen. I was dropping in or dropping out of that experience. And I was the one disturbing it or not disturbing it. I was making certain choices, and I could see that if I could just accumulate enough glimpses of joy, I might get it to be like a long-standing thread. And that's essentially what happened through the practice of yoga, so that I recovered from my disordered eating patterns and my disordered thinking as well. Joy was not coming and going. I was the one dropping out or dropping in, or having the glimpses and remembering them. And so in the third sutra, when they say you're going to abide in this essence, for me, when I was reading that later in my life after my eating disorder, I pictured it as a number of glimpses put together to amplify the experience until I could hold on to it. The misunderstanding there was that I was going to hold on to it because it is much bigger than any one of us, and this big it is holding us. We are not holding on to it. It, as an immensity, is holding us. So, if possible, we start resting in that. We start relaxing into that larger presence. And Patanjali and his friends had enough of their own distress that they say in the fourth sutra, well, by the way, if that's not what's happening for you, these are probably the sorts of things you're experiencing. And they go on to describe in the next few sutras, you're probably caught up in different mind states, and you're probably navigating different ways of knowing or experiencing the world. And some of these probably aren't working that well for you. So I'll talk about those mind states. They actually have names, and you won't see, in the classical translation of the sutras, you won't see these 5 mind states named in the first pada. But Swami Rama puts it here in the beginning when he's talking about it, so it's in his commentary. He says, there are 5 states of mind: disturbed, dull, distracted, one-pointed, and lucid. When I was heavily preoccupied with my behaviors and self-hatred and shame, I was disturbed. I was on the pinky finger part of my hand here. So it was very disturbed mind. Now, I felt that I was going to get some ease from that, from all those thoughts and all those behaviors. I was going to somehow finally get control over something, so I wouldn't be so disturbed. I would be like stable or clear, or at least not so troubled. I had no concept of lucid as an option. I only had like 2 stations. Either I'm going to be perpetually disturbed by this, or I'm going to have moments where I'm not disturbed. That's all I could conceive of. You're relating to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just had 2 stations, back when TVs only had, what was it, like CBS and NBC? ABC? Is that still around? Okay, there's 3 stations. PBS. Which always seemed to be malfunctioning somehow, but PBS didn't come in as clearly as the other ones. But I just had like disturbed or not disturbed. That was all I got as options. And after my eating disorder went on for some time, I got to have disturbed, dull, or not disturbed. Like really disturbed and agitated, or in a part of my cycle now, really dull and depressed and lethargic, and like, this will never get better, and I felt hopeless. So I got to vacillate between disturbed and dull for a long time, with a third option, a hopeful option of not being disturbed. But it didn't really come that way. Disturbed and dull were long-standing habits at that point, so to get out of that riptide, I discovered by chance the practice of Vipassana meditation. And I went to sit on a green-colored cushion at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, where the teacher, whose name is Larry, I just forgot his last name. But he was telling us the story that in his training back in Burma and other places on the planet, they had to still their mind enough to know that if they were in the jungle, they could be still in the face of a tiger. And he said, well, I chose green cushions for you guys as students because here is our urban jungle. And I'd like you to learn to be still enough in the face of your own thoughts, your own tiger thoughts, that you won't be distressed. Larry Rosenberg, that's his name. Does anybody know Larry Rosenberg? He's from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, when he said that, I was enamored of the possibility of a monk being still enough in the jungle that with their own presence they could still a tiger. Because my eating disorder was like a tiger. I would prefer that it had gotten stilled, but it hadn't happened yet. So I went to his course and I sat, and I noticed that primarily my mind was very distracted. I was sitting still, but my mind was not. Like many people, when we first come to the practice, at least I got some awareness that I was distracted. So in these 5 mind states, you have disturbed is the least auspicious, dull is a little better than disturbed, and distracted is an improvement over dull. Well, I was improving. I was only distracted. I wasn't like profoundly disturbed or terribly dull. I was just distracted. I was experiencing ordinary mind. And we go from disturbed to dull to distracted, and with enough practice, and we hear this in the Sutras, practicing consistently enough over a relatively long period of time with the quality of practice that produces the possibility then of becoming one-pointed, which is the 4th mind state. And one-pointed is considered grace. You've gone from disturbed to dull to distracted to one-pointed. That's tremendous. People will say, well, I am one-pointed. I was one-pointed on calories. I was one-pointed on self-hatred. I was one-pointed on getting the bills paid. I was one-pointed on my self-critical thoughts. That's not what we're referring to. This one-pointed attention, each of these mind states, they're getting less and less disturbable. They're becoming less agitatable. So when you're moving from disturbed, a disturbed mind state could be one-pointed on hatred. But the one-pointed mind state is one-pointed on presence. It's one-pointed in the actual present moment, in what's real and tangible, in both the fullness and the emptiness of the present moment. And when I say that, your mind should have a little fritz. Your left brain will not understand when I say, in the fullness and the emptiness of the present moment, we are practicing one-pointed attention. That fullness means the fullness of the sensory experience as it is, already satisfied, and the emptiness of grasping and aversion. And sitting in that mind state long enough, we are nudged to and become available to lucid, which is the 5th state of mind. So disturbed, dull, distracted, one-pointed, and lucid. And I think we long for lucid. We have substances to produce lucid. We've been fascinated with those substances for a long time. I just read an article that Jay gave me from one of his magazines. In his clinical practice, they actually have a waiting room with magazines. And those magazines come home to me, which I quickly rifle through and enjoy. And this one was an article about a person when he was a teenager who went to a rave and was using ecstasy and had this profound experience of like love and possibility and seeing himself as not worth hating. And even though when the drug was wearing off, he thought that would wear off also, it didn't. Mm-hmm. He was able to stabilize and seeing himself as a person not worth hating. Mm-hmm. And that lasted long enough that he was pulling himself out of his depression using a drug that altered his mind towards lucid. Mm-hmm. He wasn't making a big political statement in this particular article. It was called a 2-minute, what do they call that part in the magazine? The 2-minute story or something?
Yeah, I forgot the name of that.
It's like a little thing you could read in 2 minutes about somebody's life experience of coming into awakening. And he was making the case that some brains will benefit from a proper use of certain lucid creating substances. And that we should be careful. He did say that in his article. He's a grown-up now. So we should be careful. But we are intrigued and have been for centuries about lucid as a mind state, as a heart state, as a possibility for the human being to experience lucid or to experience awe or love or expansiveness. We're haunted enough that we want to go to the moon and feel like the big cosmos out there. Do most of you in this room have some longing to experience lucid? Would you prefer it over disturbed? Do you have more experience with disturbed and dull or more experience with lucid?
Probably right.
Generally, as a culture and as a species right now, we have more experience with disturbed, dull, and distracted. We have less experience with one-pointed and lucid. The bad news is that disturbed and dull are highly activated states. They're very rajasic, is a word that we would use to describe that, and they're contagious. Mm-hmm. Rajasic in that it's highly activating to you and to your brain circuits, and the brain circuits that keep you highly activated, like your limbic brain, your reptilian brain, and it's very contagious for other people to pick up on it. The really good news is that lucid is a very powerful brain state also. It's an enormous vibrational experience, and that's also contagious. And we'll know that we're more in that lucid presence when we don't have the need to impose it on somebody else. The need to impose it, we're back in distracted mind state where self and other have to be improved. And we want to impose our lucid understanding on somebody else. But lucid itself, as an awakened brain state, doesn't feel like it needs to impose itself on somebody else. Disturbed wants other people to feed it. So on the spectrum, yoga is asking us to move towards lucid awareness. And in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali tells us there's 5 ways of knowing about life, and any one of these 5 is occurring when we're not in the stillness of the fluctuations of the mind ceasing. So these 5 states, you can, when I say them, you can notice how you use them today, how you already use them. I'm sure that you have. I feel a high percentage of accuracy that you've used these 5 mind knowings today. Okay, one of them is memory. Has anybody today relied on memory for anything? Has anybody today reflected on a memory? Did the memory come spontaneously? Yeah, it offered itself. Here I am. I was remembering somehow, I think there's a new season in our household of boxed cereals that Jason's bringing home. I haven't seen them before. I had a Fruit Loops memory today. I had a memory of some of those cereals that we ate as kids with presents in the bottom, the little gift thing at the bottom, and you're competing for that with your siblings. And that memory led to another memory, which led to another memory, and then to another one. Memory is one of the 5 kinds of knowing. So when memory is inauspicious, it means it's really distracting because you're caught in the past. But memory as a way of knowing can also remind you that you had a glimpse of lucid, or you had a glimpse of relief. Or memory might remind you that you experienced joy recently. And if dull and disturbed are really strong mind states for somebody, they might have to write down when they had a joyful moment, so that when they're remembering how bad it's been, some memory of evidence says, I was joyful yesterday, but I'm telling myself I'm never joyful. And yet there it is, documented. I wrote it down. I'm using my memory to help my present moment experience. You follow?
Yeah.
So memory as a thing, it's one of the ways of knowing. It's neither good nor bad, but when we get stuck in it, it's called rumination. We are fixated to the past. And we want memory to produce the possibility of what's next. So that causes fantasy or imagination, like about how the future is going to unfold, or how this present moment should be different than it is right now. How many of you got to have imagination or fantasy today? Mm-hmm. Maybe you even imagined how the day was going to unfold. Or you had a thought, a whimsical thought. I had this happen today too. It was amazing. I thought about Oreo cookies. I was lying in bed for some time. Oreos somehow came to mind. Imagination. There were no Oreos within reach, nor did I want to actually eat an Oreo, but it came to mind. Then I had memory about Oreos. Oh, I know how that happened. Now I'm remembering how that came to mind. Just like that. So, imagination and fantasy, when we are perseverating on that, when we are stuck in grasping for that to happen, that's problematic. Causes more of a disturbed mind state. When we have imagination and we're never going to get to achieve it, we get dull mind state. But fantasy or imagination is also the source of problem solving. So it can be really helpful. If you can't conceive of a different possibility through fantasy or imagination, you don't have the opening into a new way of thinking or living. So we want fantasy or imagination to be alive, but use it for the creative unfolding of your life, not for constant grasping and perseverating. Getting lost in fantasy, have you guys said that about yourself from time to time?
Yes.
Sometimes it's kind of a pleasant escape. Ancient yogis wouldn't recommend. I don't actually know of any other teaching on the planet that would say, let's get lost in fantasy for a long time. Realization is on the other side of that. But in yoga teaching, sometimes in asana class, we are asking people to imagine something, like imagine your shoulder blades melting down your back, or imagine the breath as expansive as possible, or imagine your root system growing down into the ground. We're asking people to use their imagination purposely for the intention to stabilize their mind and awaken their body, their vitality, their heart. So just to use it wisely. The third kind of knowing is called deep sleep. Also referred to as ignorance, like when you fall asleep about the nature of things. But we need deep sleep for rest. We don't need deep ignorance to rest, but we do need the mental timeout of deep sleep. Now the ignorance part of that, when we say deep sleep, like falling into great forgetfulness, it means that people forget their basic nature or the basic nature of others. So we forget the indwelling possibility. Before I could be caught in fantasy and memory about my eating disorder, I had to experience ignorance. I had to experience forgetting my basic nature. And I experienced that forgetfulness in the eyes of people around me, because it's always a social construct. You don't know yourself as a child on your own. You know yourself in the eyes of others. So forgetfulness was like a systemic problem. And in that forgetting, I could forget that the body had some indwelling intelligence, and that there was some spark that was meant to be me. And in the face of forgetting, I could try to control what I was ingesting, and what I was doing, and what I thought the shape of my body was going to be. That was fantasy, by the way, that you could control your DNA and the shape of your body by certain rituals and activities. But forgetting happened before there was fantasy and memory in my case. Do you understand what I mean by that?
No. Could you restate that?
Yeah, forgetting happens, like you forget your basic nature, you forget that that indwelling thing is there, and that precedes then having the fantasy that I could change it, that I could mold it to be somehow more acceptable, or the use of memory for how I was going to keep shaping this thing.
Yes.
The forgetting happened before there were the other swings on the pendulum. And then the fourth kind of knowing is called misperception. And here we get into the other three kinds of knowing are already activated. Now you're living in misperception. Do you know people who misperceive themselves? Do you know more than one person who misperceives themselves? Do you sometimes misperceive yourself? In both directions? You misperceive your potential, you misperceive... Yes. The misperception also has a value. The misperception that can be valuable is on occasion when you see... We use this in childhood, I'll explain it in a moment, but on occasion when you see a great being and you perceive that wisdom and kindness and love in them, and you actually don't know if that's their ongoing state. It doesn't matter if it is or not, because if you're perceiving it in them and thinking, wow, that's possible, it can magnetically pull you into that possibility. So even if we are misperceiving the person and we're projecting onto them some capacity for love and expansiveness, and we're drawn to that ourselves, that's a helpful misperception. We use misperception with children when we told them fairy tales. And that was for play. But most of us outgrew some of those fairy tales, like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. It was meant for the play of things, not for like an ongoing understanding. If I misperceive that I have a certain talent and my teacher doesn't tell me otherwise, and I practice long enough and consistently enough and with enough dedication, I might grow into that talent. I practiced the trumpet for a long time. I have a twin sister who played the French horn, and when we were, you know how they test you, like in the second grade, who has musical capacity? I didn't pass the test, and my sister did. She's a music teacher today, and she still plays the French horn. I would still play my trumpet if I had it. It's in the storage unit, unfortunately. But I didn't pass the test, and Jennifer did, but the teachers wouldn't tell me that I couldn't also try it. Had they given me clear perception about the way the test came out, I probably wouldn't have picked up the trumpet. But as it went, I practiced long enough and hard enough and consistently enough that I accomplished a lot musically. And Jennifer and I were the first chair French horn and trumpet players in the state of New York, like in high school. It went that far, that we practiced that dedicatedly. But if I'd gone with the misperception that I couldn't be musically inclined, I would have limited myself. So occasionally misperception can be a guiding momentum for somebody. But with good teachership, right, with good support around that. And the fifth kind of knowing is called clear perception. That one seems like the most beneficial, right? To have clear perception. Mm-hmm. But sometimes clear perception, like absolutely clear perception, it can be an obstacle also. Clear perception might limit people's imagination for what can unfold. But clear perception, generally speaking, is more skillful to be guiding your life from. And it's more difficult to come to. Clear perception about our role in a social dynamic or an interpersonal conflict, it's very hard to come to that. It takes so much courage and self-awareness to know what we're contributing to discord or how we contribute to harmony. It takes a lot to embody and know that. So any questions at the moment about the 5 kinds of knowing, or what I said about the auspicious or the inauspicious aspects of those? Yes?
I don't remember, does the Sutras talk about how we know when we're experiencing clear perception?
Your mind will tend, in any one of those 5, it'll tend towards the lucid mind state when we're in clear perception. We might experience lucid under a moment of misperception. I will tell you this moment in my own life. This is a story I fall back on a lot, and some of you have now been to Brighton Bush Hot Springs as recently as 2 weeks ago. But I was walking across the Great Lawn at Brighton Bush. This was almost 20 years ago now. And I heard somebody practicing the harmonium, and the doors were all open in the lodge, and this person was practicing singing, and he was amplified by a microphone. And as he was playing, the music was so haunting, and I kept walking towards the lodge, and then I saw this very handsome Italian man on the stage wearing a gold chain necklace and a pair of sunglasses, singing kirtan warm-ups. I was really taken. I fell in love right there. I didn't know one thing about this person, but in my misperception of who he was, I went to this like lucid love mind state. I was not distracted in the least. I was sure. I wanted to be someone who could sing like that and to experience whatever he was experiencing, to sing that way. I didn't go further into and now I forgot his name actually. I didn't go further into, now I'll get to know him and there's going to be like a wedding and there's going to be kids. I didn't go down that whole fantasy, but I was like, this person and this singing and this embodiment of like enormous presence, I wanted that. Like I said, I didn't know anything about him, but misperception led me to a moment of lucid longing for that. And it turned out he was one of Ram Dass's, what do you call them, posses, people who came to teach when Ram Dass was there teaching, and his teachings were great. And his personal life was a mess. So if it's going more towards lucid feeling and less towards disturbed, any one of those 5 mind states can be great. Like the moment you have a feeling like, I could commit my life more to yoga, you're having a fantasy right there. You're imagining what life could be like if you had more yoga in it. And if that occurrence leads you to feel like more lucid at that moment, it's probably an inkling you should be following. And if you imagine that you're going to go play the stock market and stand in the downtown area in New York City, in the pit. What is it called? Some name they have for it. And that you're going to, what do you imagine you would experience there in the rajasic nature, that probably disturbed mind? So if you look and see where does the mind go on the 5 states, it can kind of give you a sense of what's happening and whether you're longing as a wise one or if you're grasping rather than longing. If you're caught in craving rather than possibility. Does that help some?
Mm-hmm.
Other questions that you have based on anything I've said?
I really appreciated, I can't remember where it was, but it was about how you're probably less on track if you need to tell other people about how it should be. Something like that. It was nice to be reminded about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you need to impose it on somebody else. Celebrating and understanding is different than imposing it on somebody. Yes.
How about
Go ahead, and then Lisa.
How about offering? There's imposing, but what about offering?
What's the intention for the offering?
Love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes the offering depends on who the recipient is, so I can't answer with complete specificity. But sometimes the offering is in your role modeling or in your body language. If you picture your ecosystem like an antenna, which by the way it is, you're always transmitting something. Whether people understand it clearly or they have misperception about it is quite a bit up to them. But if your antenna is transmitting love and what yoga would call non-attachment, like it's an offering without attachment to how that turns out, quite likely a person can pick up that vibration without feeling judged or imposed on. If our offering has like a hint of how I'm going to change the other person, their antenna might pick up on that.
That's very useful.
In the Yoga Sutras, we're not being taught how to change other people.
Especially if they don't ask.
They haven't asked. Yes.
And I have a problem, can you help me?
Yeah.
I'm saying, yeah, you have a problem, I could help you.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not going to work.
Lisa, did you have a question?
I was just thinking of a kind of a common phrase, delusions of grandeur, that's in our culture, and it can be so confusing because it's kind of a derogatory phrase, but you can't imagine possibilities if you don't imagine possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah. What I'm working with a lot right now in my yoga classes, because it's spring and it also occurs to me, a lot of times my personal clients, my one-to-one clients, are informing what happens in the yoga classroom. So are teacher training programs informing what I do in the yoga classroom. But one of my emphases right now in yoga class is that we can imagine that in the spring runoff of the body and the mind, as tension is dissolving from the body, so too is some mental nugget or mental cluster, some thought pattern that you've had for a long time that is no longer serving you, and that without need of cognition or intellect, you could let that mind habit wash away. You wouldn't have to log it somewhere in your journal before letting it go away. That it might not even be yours, and you've inherited it from some other conditioned person, some inheritance intergenerationally, and here it is, yours to allow to go downstream. Like you would see at the Bright Bush River, some of the debris is just going on, and we're not holding on to or grasping for it. To imagine the possibility that your mind is more and more free of that kind of residue or those nuggets, it's to imagine lucid as a possibility. And to imagine that process unfolding without need to know is to say your left brain can be at rest for now, and it's the right brain imagining that this unfolding occurs. We don't have to have intellect to affirm the experience of a lucid mind. Sometimes we are waiting for insight before we take the next leap developmentally, but it's not required from the yoga perspective. Insight will occur, but we're not waiting for insight for some of the developmental shifts you can make towards greater love and harmony. It's more like remembering that indwelling essence is there. When it's not so cluttered by the mental conditioning, it reveals itself. That's why in the third sutra they say, and then you abide in your own essence. The cessations of the fluctuations of the mind let you see more clearly what's already indwelling. But the left brain doesn't trust that as much as your right brain would. It wants to know before you surrender. It wants to know before you accept. This is why yoga becomes so important, because it uses both hemispheres of the brain, as I was saying earlier about music. Any other questions or observations or contributions for the moment, including from you?
I'd like to add one, adding to
Yes,
Tristan's
Claire.
question about misperception. Patanjali talks a lot about the senses not being reliable organs of perception.
Yeah.
And so he gives you a couple guidelines on how you can know if you are on the right path of knowing. And if I have it correct, I think it's that you often heard it for yourself. How often do we take something for gospel truth and we didn't really hear it or see it for ourselves as just gossip? And the second one is how reliable a source of information was that.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one was checking that against someone who's a little bit wiser, maybe a little bit more knowing. So he does give you guidelines on how you can do it if you know if you're on the right path. Sorry, my breath's a little off tonight, but
Yeah, no, that's very clear. You actually got it.
good.
Yes, you're checking with someone who's a little wiser than yourself. You had direct experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that it was a reliable source of information
Yeah.
to begin with.
Yeah, you heard it and it was a reliable person or source of information. Yeah.
And, so often you can go, okay, I wasn't there, so I can't really comment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so hard to withhold judgment and not say that.
Yes. Yeah. One of the significant teachings also, and I think this is a way for us to look at when we're in clear perception, misperception, imagination, memory, or deep sleep. If you keep those teachings for a moment here, and then imagine on the side over here, this is my metaphor for it right now. If you had one of those paint strips when you go to the what do you call the hardware store, like the Home Depot, and you pick out a color of paint, and it has gradations from very lightly colored to very deeply colored. So if I turn that paint thing upside down, so the darkest color is on the top, it gets incrementally lighter and lighter and lighter as I go down. So you have the 5 kinds of knowing. Are you experiencing a deeply colored thought as one of those? Are you deeply stuck in memory? Are you deeply stuck in fantasy? Are you deeply stuck in forgetfulness? How saturated, how dense is the thought associated with it? You'll be more disturbed. The deeper the coloring, the more disturbed. And you can take those 5 kinds of knowing and move down a couple gradations in that paint color. Now how deeply colored is it? Less deeply colored. I probably feel more dull. Okay, as it goes down, less deeply colored. Now I'm just more distracted by this thought. I'm less invested, it's less dense, I've contributed less to it, I'm feeding it less often, I'm kind of distracted by it. And as that keeps going, you get to the bottom of that paint chip where it's lucid. And the 5 kinds of knowing are sitting here, lucid and available for using the skillful manifestation of them. But they say it in these Yoga Sutras right here, to lessen the coloring of your thoughts. You have to participate in that actively, because the most deeply colored are the most disturbing manifestations. Did you follow, this paint chip upside down analogy? Jay's the one who gets the paint chips for us. I don't know if they're stored in the store upside down or right side up, but I turned in the darkest on top and the lightest on the bottom. But you can also, that's where you can use imagination. Can I lessen the coloring of this thought? Can I lessen the seed of self-hatred or other hatred? Can I lessen the coloring of resentment? And what happens if I do? You'll experience the movement from disturbed to dull to distracted to one-pointed to lucid. Does that sound like a hopeful process that I'm describing right there? And you can do something about it. Your thoughts are not, they're not stuck as the color that they are. We have some leadership over that process. Any other comments or questions right now? I'd like to do a meditation with you, but I'll take a last question if there is one.
I wanted to throw in one thing that I think it's because Sanger's translation of the Sutras, instead of one's own essence, he says one's true splendor. So
Yes.
it has like this uplifted
Yeah.
idea to it.
Yeah, so she's saying when Iyengar translated the word Svarupe, means our true splendor, Svarupe, the true emanation or the bliss. And in the classical translation they might say essence for that word. You're residing in your own essence, you're abiding in that. Can I ask for your help for something? Can you crack this window behind me? And Tamara, can you open that door please all the way? You can lean against the door frame once it's open, but don't squish Tristan with the door please. Jess, would you be willing to sit without a door behind you? Can you open that a little bit? Yep. The windows that are above you don't open. That's the way the room was made. Yeah. Okay, so I'd like us to sit upright and quietly. You can have support as you like or not. You can rest your hands in your lap where they're most comfortable. Lengthen your spine, but tip your chin slightly down and in towards the center of your throat. So you'll be lifting the base of your skull and also slightly bowing your mind towards your heart. I'd like you to bring your awareness now to the sounds, both subtle and obvious, that surround us. Bring your attention to the direct experience of sound without having to name it or narrate it. As you listen to sound, you do not need to choreograph your breathing. Let that be restful. And listen to even the silence beyond sound. To listen to sound is to be willing to suspend your preoccupation with your own thoughts. To listen to sound is to suspend the grasping for past or future, for memory or fantasy. Listen also to the silence beyond sound. We practice consistently, repeatedly, moment to moment. Listen to sound, the silence beyond sound. In a few moments, I'll be asking you to consider a thought cluster that you once held very deeply, a thought you had about yourself or about the world. For example, a thought that you have to attain perfection, or a thought that, quote unquote, you'll never make it, or a thought, I have to get it all done. So listen again to sound and the silence beyond sound. And notice the quality of attention or mind that comes with that. Listen to the tremendous silence beyond the movements of sound. A silence beyond what your knowing mind can grasp. Now I'd like you to bring to mind this thought cluster, some thought you had. You may have held it dearly a long time ago, maybe even for a very long time. But you've either outgrown it or you're willing to. In a moment I'll ask you to take a deep breath and to hold that thought in a very concentrated, deeply colored way in your body. Then when you hear me ring the bell, we're going to exhale the thought, releasing the body tension, and following the bell sound to silence, where this thought can evaporate. So bring that thought to your mind and body just now, and let's take a deep breath in to hold the intensity of the deeply colored thought. At the top of the inhale, hold the breath for a few moments, please. And with the bell sound, exhale very slowly. And imagine the coloring of the thought and the tension that goes with it dissolving. We're going to repeat that. Please take a deep breath in. For a few moments you'll be holding this thought cluster that once was dear to you. Maybe you've outgrown it. Maybe you are outgrowing it. Inhale and hold the breath at the top, please. And then exhale slowly, follow the sound to silence, release the exhale and the tension associated with the thought. So it becomes less and less colored. Imagine your mind and your body free from that particular conditioning. And then we'll do that one more time. So please inhale deeply. Hold the inhale at the top. Concentrate the color of that thought for a few moments. Imagine for your body, mind, and heart, that thought habit becomes translucent. You aren't obligated to it. You're not bound to it. And the inner noise of that thought fades, and the silence beyond sound is both internal and beyond the skin of your body. When you're ready to do so, you may then quietly open your eyes. And I'd like to know if that felt somewhat effective and if the instructions were clear. Clear. And did it feel somewhat effective to you? Did anybody find in the silence offered, when the thought becomes more translucent, did anybody find that you then had the question, but who would I be without that thought? It's a possibility. I'm just inoculating you that that could happen. You say, oh, I'm going to let go of this resentment, this fixation I've had on resenting people. I'm going to let go of that, or disappointment or frustration. I'm letting that dissolve. Well, who would I be without that? That Zen koan is to direct us back to the third Yoga Sutra. Who you would be without that. You would be abiding in your innate splendor. You'll be resting in that which is lucid, that Anandamaya kosha. Your essence would be larger. You wouldn't lose anything. Nothing is taken away from you in the sense of that immensity. That immensity gets blocked when our thought clusters are voluminous and crowding, so the inner experience is deeply colored, not more translucent. So I welcome you to experiment in the next few hours, if you can, but certainly the next few days, with anything resembling this. I think it'd be really fun if you could experiment with an actual record player at a certain volume and just pick up the needle and see what happens. Remind yourself, how was that? Or you could experiment with, when the phone is ringing, you let it go to silence. Like, notice the ring, the ring, the ring, what happens to the body, the mind, the nervous system, the ring, the silence. What happens when that imposition on you is gone? I think also if we are lucky, it'll rain a little bit more, and you can hear the sound of the cars on the pavement when you're meditating. We live in the city, so you might get to have that sound. Any last questions or observations? Will you practice? Okay, thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to, namaste. And I'm going to make a request that as we go mostly in silence, because there's a lot of us, and if you start chatting, it can dissipate the lovely experience you just had here. So we go mostly in silence. Words won't communicate as much as your antenna will right now. And thank you to Jay for helping me to be here tonight and for contributing also. Good night, everyone.
Amen.